Together, we are here.
Hi, hello.
Hey.
Happy to meet you.
Can you hear me now?
Hi.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I'm all right.
I don't know how to answer it, but the things are getting very tough.
It's a critical moment of human history.
This pandemic brings to bear the stark realities in which we have lived in for a very long time.
Our current system has facilitated this crisis. This crisis didn't need to be this big.
It's like crumbling and the kind of existing fault lines are being exposed.
The rules are being rewritten.
But who is writing them? How?
And for whom?
This is a lockdown.
We are on a saddle point, ready to tip in either direction.
It forces us to think about our connections.
It's an opportunity for us to reflect on what are the most important, the vital things in our lives.
To rediscover the sense of community.
The solidarity, togetherness, unity. This is something we've been yearning for.
Together, we hold each other.
We move forward.
Rebuild forwards.
Reimagine forwards.
Organize forwards.
Think forward.
Teach forwards. Is showing the kind of world that we should build together.
Welcome to the inaugural summit of the Progressive International. We launched in May this year with a mission to unite, organize, and mobilize progressive forces in a common front. Since then, this coalition has grown to include unions, parties, and movements that represent millions of people around the world. Together, the members of the Progressive International have launched campaigns on issues like debt cancellation in the Global South, developed a policy vision for reclaiming the world after COVID-19, and built a wire service for the translation and dissemination of critical perspectives shut out by mainstream media around the world. This inaugural summit is an opportunity to map our current crisis, to reclaim our shared future, and to strengthen our planetary front. We're in a moment of overlapping crises, of climate, of capital, and of a pandemic, and yet equally we see a rise in authoritarianism and neoliberal technocracy. We need progressive forces everywhere to act quickly and decisively. This weekend, we're convening scholars, policymakers, activists, and movements to confront this central dilemma of our time: internationalism or extinction. We're inviting movements to share their struggles and shape the future of this initiative, to collectively envision 21st century internationalism and share strategies about building power during COVID-19. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today, including keynote speeches from Noam Chomsky, Yanis Varoufakis, and Naomi Klein, along with panel discussions on the prospects for post-capitalism around the world and the future of democracy in Latin America. And we're, of course, also joined by you, members of our public, who've reached out to us from around the globe and are joining us live today for this broadcast. We're so honored and so excited to be together today, and thank you all for your support and solidarity. For those in our audience who'd like to follow along in other languages, you can find the links to translations in the event description below. So let's get started. I'm Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla from the Secretariat of the Progressive International. And for our first session, What Comes After Capitalism, I'm joined today by members of our council. Our keynote speaker is Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis is a member of the Hellenic Parliament and co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement. Our panelists include Vijay Prashad, who is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, AJ Temelkaran, who is an award-winning novelist, political commentator, and journalist from Turkey, and Nick Estes, scholar and activist who co-founded the Red Nation, an indigenous resistance organization. I'm so honored to be sharing the stage with you today to discuss what comes after capitalism. The horizon of post-capitalism is coming into clearer focus. But it remains to be seen if the post-capitalist economy will be authoritarian and oligarchic or democratic and social. So Yanis Varoufakis will kick off this discussion with opening remarks on how we can win the fight for a post-capitalist future. Yanis is the Secretary General of the European Realistic Disobedience Front, the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, DiEM25, and the former finance minister of Greece. He's the author of several books, including Adults in the Room and The Weak Suffer What They Must. Yanis, thank you so much for being here today, and you have the floor for 30 minutes.
Varsha, thank you so much. And thank you to all the extremely hard members of the Secretariat, to which you belong, for managing to stage this magnificent event. I wish we were all in Reykjavik or somewhere around the world where we were planning to have a face-to-face meeting, but this will have to do for the time being. It's an incredible opportunity for a launch or relaunch of the Progressive International. The question I'm going to be asking today has two axes. One is, why a Progressive International? Why do we need a Progressive International? And the second part of the same question, why does the Progressive International need to think about post-capitalism? The era we live in will be remembered for the triumph of what I call a twin authoritarianism, in whose wake the vast majority of humanity experience unnecessary hardship, and the planet's ecosystem suffers avoidable climate change. But I want to take you a bit further back. For a brief period, what Eric Hobsbawm referred to as the short 20th century. The establishment forces were united in dealing with challenges from progressives, from a variety of progressives. You'll recall that there were the original social democrats who sought to redistribute power from capital to labor within capitalism. There were the Soviet-linked regimes that experimented with non-capitalist but centralized modes of production. There was Yugoslavia trying its hand out, very interestingly, with self-management. There were the national liberation movements in Africa. There was the original radical green movement in places like Western Germany. Back then, the establishment was united against all those progressive challenges to its authority. Personally, I grew up in this town in Athens under a right-wing fascist dictatorship that was instigated by the United States administration under Lyndon Johnson, which was, paradoxically, the most progressive administration within the United States when it came to domestic policies, to the Great Society, to the Civil Rights Movement, and yet they did not hesitate to carpet bomb Vietnam and to prop up fascists in my country. Indeed, what we now call the liberal establishment used fascists and local despots liberally to prop up the so-called Western way of life. The fear and loathing of right-wing populism, which today can be found on every page of the New York Times, was simply absent back then. Only the progressives were portrayed by the liberal establishment as a threat to Western civilization, never the Papadopoulos or Pinochet monsters. Now, things changed remarkably after 2008, the year the Western financial system imploded. Following 25 years or so of financialization under the guise and the cloak of ideology called neoliberalism, global capitalism in 2008 had its 1929 moment that nearly brought it to its knees. The immediate reaction was to use the central bank's printing presses, but also to transfer huge losses from the bankers onto the shoulders of the weakest citizens around the world in order to deflate financial institutions and markets. This combination of socialism for the very, very, very few and stringent austerity for the masses did two things. First, it depressed real investment globally. Firms could see that the masses, the hoi polloi as the Americans say, just didn't have the money to buy their wares, so they did not invest. At the same time, the printing presses of the central banks were creating huge quantities of cash savings liquidity for the rich, primarily. The result was this discontent amongst the many and the stupendous riches amongst the oligarchy. Secondly, the second thing it did, it gave rise initially to progressive movements, uprisings. You will remember, Occupy Wall Street in the United States, in Britain, the Indignados in Spain, the Aganaktismeni here in Syntagma Square in Greece, various left-wing forces that even managed to get their hands on some government levers in Latin America. But they were all, one after the other, dealt with efficiently, either by the establishment directly, think of the way they crashed the Athens Spring, the Greek Spring here in the summer of 2015, or indirectly through the stagnation of global capitalism. Think of Latin American progressive regimes that effectively were undermined as Chinese demand for their exports collapsed as a result of the imbalance between global savings and global investment. As progressive causes were snuffed out, one after the other, the discontent of the masses had to find an expression. It was then that a postmodern mid-war period emerged, mimicking the rise of Mussolini, who, remember, Mussolini promised to look after the weakest and to make them feel proud to be Italian again. Our generation witnessed the rise of what I call a nationalist international. The rightist expression of Brexit. Remember the slogan, "We want our country back." Donald Trump, "We're going to look after those that Wall Street left behind." Bolsonaro, Modi, Le Pen, Salvini, Orban. It is thus that, for the first time since the Second World War, the great political clash was not between the establishment and assorted progressives, but between different parts of the authoritarian establishment. One part appearing as the stalwarts of liberal democracy, the other as the representatives of illiberal democracy. Of course, this clash between the liberal establishment and the Nationalist International was utterly illusory. Mr. Macron, the president of France, needed Marine Le Pen. Without Marine Le Pen, Macron could never be president. And Marine Le Pen needed Macron and the liberal establishment, whose austerity policies were fanning the flame of discontent which made Le Pen a political player. Nevertheless, the fact that the liberal establishment and the Nationalist International were in reality accomplices does not mean that the cultural and personal clash between them was not real, was not authentic. The authenticity of that clash between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, as an example, despite the lack of any real policy difference between them, what did Trump do when he moved into the White House? He took, people from Wall Street instead of draining the swamp and put them in the Treasury. So despite this non-existent policy difference between them, the authentic clash between those characters made it next to impossible for progressives to be heard over the cacophony caused by this clash. This is, I submit to you, friends, why we need the Progressive International. Because the fake opposition between the two variants of the twin authoritarianisms of the liberal establishment and of the Nationalist International threaten humanity. And they threaten humanity by trapping us in a business-as-usual agenda that destroys life prospects and wastes opportunities to end climate change. How can we break the stranglehold of these twin authoritarianisms? Look at our defeats in Greece in July 2015, when a promising progressive rebellion against austerity for the people and bailouts for the oligarchy took place. Or look at the successful undermining of Jeremy Corbyn and of Bernie Sanders within their own political parties. Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, very much like popular progressive leaders in Brazil, Bolivia, and Ecuador, were driven out of the political contest. Look at the way a veil of silence is drawn over the courageous struggles for self-determination by countless communities in Asia and in Africa. Look carefully at this multitude of defeats, and I think you will agree that the only one thing that could prevent them is an effective, well-organized progressive international. Has the time not come, friends, for progressives to emulate the bankers and the fascists in one way? in utilizing, deploying, and energizing internationalism? Is it not time to follow their example, to unite across borders behind a common agenda, to create a common narrative, to press our capacities into the service of the same agenda in favor of the many, deploying a joint investment plan into saving the planet? This is the time, I submit to you. I think the time has truly come. Now is the moment when either we form an effective, successful, progressive international, or we share the blame for humanity's failure to serve people and planet. But what does a progressive international entail in practical terms? I hear many of you ask, what does it mean in practice? While such a grand project cannot be based on anyone's blueprint and must be constructed organically and democratically, through crowdsourcing of ideas, if you will, at least one thing is clear to me. The progressive international cannot succeed if it simply emulates efforts like the World Social Forum or the brilliantly open discussion format of Occupy Wall Street, of the Αγανακτισμένοι Σύνταγμα Square, of the Indignados, which gave a platform to everyone to express themselves. We need something that these earlier attempts at bringing progressives together lacked: a common program and a collective action plan. I've already spoken in favor of confronting the internationalism of the bankers and the fascists with a progressive internationalism. The fascists and the bankers, lest we forget, do possess a common program. Whether you speak to a banker in Chile or to a banker in Switzerland, you will hear the same narrative, the same story: how financial engineering provides the capital necessary to invest in everything we need, blah, blah, blah. We know why privatization is a must, that only fools and irrational thinkers dispute, the need to offer investors certainty against local legislatures and populists and parliaments and courts. Similarly, every time you speak to a member of the Nationalist International, you'll hear the same story: how electrified border fences are essential for sovereign democracies, the threat to our culture and to our social welfare system from migrant labor, the importance of looking after the natives while making the life of those deemed less than loyal or worthy citizens or of their own religion make their life harder. My point is, we progressives also need a common program. We must also speak with one humanist, programmatic voice across the world. Talk, of course, is cheap unless backed by action. The liberal establishment do not have this problem. They're in government almost everywhere. And even if not in actual government, they are certainly in power. Their politicians, bureaucrats, and bankers act upon the world every second of the day, always and consistently in a manner that promotes their own collective common program. The Nationalist International also act upon the world, whether through violence on the streets of Portland or Piraeus, or through the policies of Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi. They are never short of a series of acts in total harmony with their misanthropic, xenophobic, reactionary common agenda. We need to emulate them. In this regard, too, we need to plan and carry out collective actions. So in summary, the Progressive International needs, in my view, two things: a common program and an uncommon collective action plan. Now, what collective action plan should we envisage? You remember Chris Smalls, who used to work in an Amazon warehouse somewhere in New Jersey, I believe? He shot momentarily to fame when it was revealed that after having fired him for staging a protest against the unhygienic conditions in the Amazon warehouse where he worked, Amazon's uber-powerful directors spent a long teleconference planning his character's assassination. Even though a considerable number of public figures spoke out in Chris's defense, the furor had no effect. Amazon emerged from the lockdown richer, stronger, and more influential than ever. As for Chris, once his 5 minutes of fame were over, he remained fired and vilified. Now, what would it take for the Progressive International, if we had already established ourselves properly as an organization back then, what would it take to make a difference? Imagine that we were to call globally a day of inaction, a particular day of the week, of a month, when we call upon citizens of the world not to visit the Amazon website just for one day. Now, it costs nothing not to visit Amazon.com for one day, even if you are a heavy Amazon user. But the cost to Amazon would be very significant. This could be a start, identifying multinational companies that abuse workers locally, and for us to target them globally, utilizing the great disparity between the costs to participants in such action and the cost to the targeted firms would be a good start. Then, in a follow-up phase, a second phase, we could combine these consumer days of inaction with trade union days of action at the local level, aimed at the company and its affiliates. The prospect of such global action in support of local workers or communities has immense scope. With some clever communication and planning, such acts and campaigns can become a popular way people around the world can embrace to get a feeling that they are helping make the world a freer and fairer place. And what should our common plan be? What should we be striking for? Well, the good news is that we now have an array of different Green New Deals to choose from. However, while each one of them contains useful ideas, I think we need to synthesize them into an overarching, coherent, internationally coordinated plan, an international Green New Deal that is common to all progressives. We know what we must do, what must be part and parcel of this international grid. We need power generation that shifts massively from fossil fuels to renewables. We need land transport that must be electrified, while air transport shipping must turn to new zero carbon fuels like hydrogen. Meat production needs substantially to diminish, greater emphasis on organic plant crops, strict limits on physical growth, for anything from toxins and CO2 production to cement. We also know that all this is going to cost at least $8 trillion a year. So we need to find ways of creating or imagining, envisioning, planning institutions that will coordinate the various works and distribute the costs and benefits between the global north and the global south. Now, the task seems enormous, undoubtedly. In a world where even the modest Paris Agreement is in tatters, it sounds like an ominous undertaking. This is precisely why we need a New Deal narrative at a planetary scale. The reason why Roosevelt succeeded in 1933 was because his New Deal came at a time when the grapes of wrath were filling and growing heavy for the vintage. Its singular achievement was to address people who had given up and to inspire in them the hope that astonishingly there is an alternative, that there are ways of pressing idle resources, idle cash, huge mountains of cash doing nothing, into public service. The New Deal's success was to present a plan that made sense to the disheartened and offered opportunity to the entrepreneurial, a plan that changed the frame from which a majority of people assessed their collective circumstances and capacities. The key questions of funding and distribution can also be answered through this new frame. The $8 trillion that I mentioned can be easily financed both from public and private sources. Public finance, just like that of the original New Deal, must involve transnational bond instruments and revenue-neutral carbon taxes so that the money raised from, for instance, taxing diesel can be returned to the poorest of citizens relying on diesel cars in order to strengthen them generally, but also allow them to buy an electric car. Meanwhile, how do we defeat tax evasion without an internationally minimum corporate tax rate? That is internationalism in action. Say 25% minimum corporate tax, which can then be redistributed around the world, taking into account the geographical distribution of the sales of the multinationals. To plow these resources into green investments, we need new organizations. How about a new organization for Emergency Environment Cooperation, OEEC, the namesake of the original OEEC, which was used in the 1950s to channel Marshall Plan funding into Europe for the purposes of rebuilding. This time it would not be rebuilding, it would be building up brand new green technologies, the green transition, not rebuilding the brown polluting industries. The OEEC could pull the brain power as well of the international scientific community into something like a Green Manhattan Project, only one that aims, instead of mass murder, it aims at ending extinction. Even more ambitiously, the Progressive International can propose an international monetary clearing union of the type that John Maynard Keynes proposed at Bretton Woods in 1944, including well-designed restrictions on capital movements. By rebalancing wages, trade, and finance at a planetary scale, both involuntary migration and involuntary unemployment will recede, therefore ending the moral panic over the human right to move freely about the planet. Friends, the need for a common agenda and a collective action plan for us all means that the Progressive International needs to feature an international organization. The great question for all of us involved in this magnificent initiative of the Progressive International, the great question is, how can we create this essential organization without falling prey to the usual organizational pitfalls like exclusion, bureaucracy, power games within organizations? This is a difficult question that members of the Progressive International must address. It's not a question I have an answer to, but not having an answer to it is a good thing. This is an answer we must come up with together. We must crowdsource it, we must crowdfund it, we must co-create it. But the one point I want to make at this juncture is that the difficulty in answering this question about how are we going to get organized is no excuse for not proceeding. The bankers and the fascists have found answers. Okay? It is harder for us progressives because we have a natural aversion to hierarchies, to bureaucracies, to the encroachments of patriarchy and paternalism. It's harder for us to find a way of organizing ourselves at a global scale, but we have a duty to find answers. Friends, some say that the time for a Green New Deal has come and gone, that this is too late, that capitalism cannot be civilized, tamed, or rendered compatible with humanity's survival. I have to admit that I agree with them. An international Green New Deal is necessary. On this I have no doubt, but I do believe it is not sufficient. Now consider what happened about a month ago on the 12th of August, 2020. The day the news broke in London that the British economy had its greatest slump in its history, more than 20% down national income. Minutes later, the London Stock Exchange jumped up by 2%. Similarly, look at Wall Street, look at the financial centers around the world. Financial markets are doing pretty well, thank you very much, at a time when workers and industrial capital are suffering massively. In other words, the world of money and finance is decoupled from the world of production. Capitalism has undermined itself to such an extent that maybe we have already stepped into what I call post-capitalism without realizing. Of course, not the post-capitalism that us progressives and socialists envisaged once upon a time. Our Progressive International needs seriously to take into account the possibility that capitalism is not only worth terminating for good progressive socialist reasons, but more pressingly, that capitalism is going through a spasm that is yielding a dystopic post-capitalism as we speak. If I'm right on this, even members of the Progressive International who still entertain hopes of civilizing capitalism must consider the possibility that the Progressive International has a duty to look beyond capitalism. Indeed, to plan for a decent humanist post-capitalism. While this is not the moment to plan for post-capitalism, it is useful to begin imagining what it might be like. Without a capacity for imagining what comes after capitalism, that we mix in with our realistic international Green New Deal, our progressive international will fail to inspire either us oldies in need of a boost of hope, or the generation of youngsters seeking a vision worth fighting for. In a book that came out just last week, called Another Now, I try to do this imagining, to imagine, for instance, imagine that my generation, our generation, back in 2008, responded to the collapse of financial markets. Creatively, imagine we staged peacefully a high-tech revolution that led to a post-capitalist economic democracy. What would it look like? Now, to be desirable, at least from where I'm standing, our post-capitalism should definitely feature markets for goods and services. The alternative to having markets for, potatoes is a Soviet-type rationing system that vests arbitrary power in the ugliest of bureaucrats. Too dreary for my imagination. But to be crisis-proof and not misanthropic, there is one market that post-capitalism must definitely do without: the labor market. Why? Because once labor, or labor time if you want, has a rental price, the market mechanism inexorably pushes the price of labor time down while commodifying every aspect of people's work, even of people's leisure, during the epoch of Facebook. The greater the system's success in doing this, in pushing down the rental price of labor and commodifying the labor process, the less the exchange value of each unit of output, the lower the average profit rate for capitalist firms, and ultimately the nearer the next capitalist crisis. Can an advanced economy function without labor markets? You bet it can. Amending corporate law so as to turn every employee into an equal partner with the same share, one employee, one share, one vote. Doesn't mean that they are remunerated equally, but they're equal partners. That would be as unimaginably radical a move today as universal suffrage was in the 19th century. By granting every employee one share, one vote, the idea that was initially proposed in the 1920s, if you recall, by the anarcho-syndicalists, the distinction, the tug of war between wages and profits ends. And with a new digital collaborative tool standing by to remove all inefficiencies that would otherwise hamper the prospects of a democratically run corporation, the possibility of a democratized economic life, production process, becomes distinct. That would bring immediately the demise of share markets, because then shares would simply not be tradable. And the moment you have the demise of share markets, you have the demise of mergers and acquisitions. Throw into the mix central banks that provide every resident in their country with a free digital bank account. They're already thinking about doing this under capitalism. Once debt leverage from mergers and acquisitions linked to share markets that now have become extinct, once they disappear, what is the point of banks? Banks disappear too. Goldman Sachs and the like become extinct without even the need to ban them legally. Now, what if we take this idea a bit further, proposing that the central bank credits everybody's central bank digital bank account with a fixed monthly stipend, a universal basic dividend? As everyone would use their central bank account to make domestic payments, most of the money would be shifting from one part of the database of the ledger of the central bank to another. Additionally, the central bank can be instructed to grant a certain amount of money to every newborn baby, a trust fund for every baby, which they can use when they grow up, when they're 18. Therefore, persons in this system, market system, But socialist market system, post-capitalist market system would have two forms of income. One is money that comes in as a social dividend, and money that comes in the form of profit shares, income, from participating in the corporate syndicalist economy, market economy that I mentioned before. In this economy, how does the government get funded? No more income tax is necessary. No sales taxes are necessary. Imagine just three forms of taxation. One is you tax every company, which are, of course, all cooperatives. You just tax 5% of their revenues. That's the first tax. Secondly, a carbon tax. We will always need a carbon tax until we go to, a zero carbon emitting economy. And thirdly, proceeds from leasing land which belongs in its entirety to the community. It is leased for private time-limited use, and the rental goes to the community. Now, once we have imagined these changes, suddenly a market socialist blueprint has almost written itself. Freed from corporate power, unshackled from the indignity imposed upon the needy by the welfare state, and liberated from the tyranny of the clash between profits and wages, persons and communities can begin to imagine new ways of deploying their talents and creativity. Friends, summing up, faced with the onerous task of fighting against the twin authoritarianisms, we progressives need a plan. We need a common organization, and we need a common will to envision post-capitalism together. Our Progressive International is a unique opportunity to satisfy these three historic needs. Across the world, we can do it.
Thank you so much, Yanis. Thank you so much, Yanis, for setting the stage with those powerful words. I understand that you have to leave the office because a hurricane is reaching Greece. Certainly, or hopefully not a sign of the dark sign of the times, but we'll connect with you later in the session. Thanks so much again for your opening remarks. I'd like to turn to our panelists now to deliver their remarks and sort of ask how they might agree or disagree with this vision of post-capitalism and how we get there. I first invite Vijay Prashad, who's the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief editor of Leftward Books, a publishing house in New Delhi, and chief correspondent of Globetrotter. He's the author of 30 books, most recently Washington Bullets. It's a terrific book I've just begun and can't quite put it down. And it has a preface by Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia. Vijay, you have the floor.
Thanks, Vasha. Thanks, Yanis, Essie, and Nick. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Although, of course, it would have been even more delightful if we were together in Iceland. If we could hug each other, really, that would have been great. If we could march shoulder to shoulder down the streets of Reykjavik to announce the necessity of a system other than this catastrophic one. But here we are. At least we are here. As the Lebanese Marxist Mahdi Amel used to quite frequently say, as long as you are resisting, you have not been defeated. Not only are we resisting, we are also imagining something other than this mess of the Davos International, as Yanis put it, and its uglier twin, the Nationalist International. Twins of the bourgeoisie, twins who control the fate of the planet, but have no positive ideas to deal with the real problems that grip us. The pandemic immediately, of course, but then deeper than that, terrible crises of hunger and hopelessness, the plagues of war and displacement, hungry bellies confronted by bullets rather than by food. The twins speak in a different tone, but say the same sorts of things about economics and politics, denying all of us, a future. This denial of a future is a genuine thing. These twins have told us for at least 100 years that a future is impossible. So certainly no one denies that we have a past or a present. You'd have to have a delusion to say we don't live in the present or that we haven't had a past. What they deny us is a future, telling us that this present is to remain eternal, that no real change is possible, only incremental reforms if the working class and the peasantry are willing to forego immediate improvements and forego their modest savings to finance this or that change. The wealthy bondholders and their cousins refuse to part with their money to finance any improvements in the world, least of all to finance the Green New Deal. If there is any improvement to be financed in this system, they say it should be funded by the theft of wages from the workers and the peasants and from debt that will eventually be paid by regressive taxation. Ghastly are the ways of the owners of property and the monopolizers of privilege. Ghastly is the way they have organized the world. Yanis has laid out the problems well, but there is one aspect that I'd like to add to his analysis, and that is the centrality of imperialism to the structure of the world system. What is imperialism? Few countries which built up their wealth through colonialism and enslavement of human beings have built enormous militaries and control international systems of trade and finance in order to plunder natural resources, exploit workers, and increase and consolidate profits and power. These countries, controlled by their corporations, bully the rest of the world to do their bidding. At their center is the United States of America. The United States military budget at $1.6 trillion a year is larger than the next 7 largest military budgets combined. There is much hue and cry about the Chinese military, but bear this in mind. For every $1 that the Chinese spend on their military, the United States spends nearly $3. The United States has a staggering 883 military bases in 183 countries. In contrast, Russia has 10 bases, 8 of them in the countries of the former USSR. China has only 1 overseas military base. There is no country in the world with a military footprint that replicates that of the United States. Why does the United States have such a large military presence? Not to keep the world free for democracy, as they say, and as Mike Pompeo is going to be saying in Brazil, and as the Brazilian people, of course, are saying, fora Pompeo, no Pompeo, get out Pompeo. They are not spending this money to keep the world free for democracy, but rather to suffocate any aspiration for sovereignty by the world's peoples. War crimes are legion, which is why the United States sanctions International Criminal Court judges who want to investigate the US war on Afghanistan, and why the United States and the United Kingdom are going after Julian Assange. What was Julian guilty of? To reveal, thanks to the bravery of Chelsea Manning, the terrible war crimes of the NATO militaries. If a poorer country tries to stand upright, seeks to exercise its sovereignty, a full arsenal of power is used against it. Financial, diplomatic, and military power. This is known as the hybrid war. The United States has imposed a hybrid war upon Iran and against Venezuela, and most dangerously against China. China's scientific and technological advances have seriously threatened the Western technology sector, which, unable to compete on commercial grounds, seeks to use the hybrid war to undermine Chinese companies and China itself. It beggars belief to accuse Chinese firms such as Huawei of violating the privacy of their consumers, when we know, thanks to Edward Snowden, that the United States-based Silicon Valley firms already send consumer data to the US government. This attack on China, as the United States attacks Cuba, and as we saw the US-backed coup against Bolivia, this attack on China is not about facts, but about the vulnerability of the economic superiority of the imperialist bloc. The managers of the capitalist system are quick to unholster their guns and point them at distant adversaries, drive their tanks into our lands and occupy our homes. It is easier for them to provoke war than to fill the bellies of human beings with food. They would rather inflame people with racism and jingoism than to manage the fact that a broken system has come to rely more and more on the unpaid care labor of women, more and more on the harsh working conditions imposed on miners and factory workers. The planet is on fire. The virus is on the march. Hunger stalks the land. And yet, even in this mess, we, the vast majority of the people on the planet, have not given up on the possibility of a future. We hope for something better than this, a world beyond profit and privilege, a world beyond capitalism, and so a world beyond imperialism. Our hearts are bigger than their guns. Our love and our struggle will overcome their greed and their indifference. We need to act together. We need platforms like the Progressive International. As Ernst Bloch wrote, we must believe in the principle of hope. A Marxist does not have the right to be a pessimist. Comrades, not for us the mood of pessimism. Not for us the slogan, socialism or barbarism. For us, the watchword is clear, socialism. There is no other alternative. As the poet Kaifi Azmi wrote in Makan, "Aaj ki raat bahut garam hawa chalti hai, aaj ki raat na footpath pe neend aayegi, sab utho, main bhi uthun, tum bhi utho, tum bhi utho, koi khidki is diwar mein khul jayegi. A hot wind blows tonight. It will be impossible to sleep on the pavement. Arise, everyone. I will rise too, and you, and yourself too. So a window may open in these walls. Sab utho, main bhi uthun, tum bhi utho, tum bhi utho." Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Vijay. I want to now invite AJ Temelkuran and Nick Estes to also give a few remarks. AJ Temelkuran is one of Turkey's best-known novelists and political commentators, appearing in The Guardian, New York Times, New Statesman, and Der Spiegel. Her recent novel, Women Who Blow on Knots, won the 2017 Edinburgh International Book Festival First Book Award. She is a recipient of the PEN Translate Award, the New Ambassador of Europe Prize, and has honorary citizenship from the city of Palermo for her work on behalf of oppressed voices. Nick Estes is an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. Nick is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, and in 2014, he co-founded the Red Nation, an indigenous resistance organization. For 2017 to 18, Estes was the American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, and his research engages colonialism and global indigenous histories with a focus on decolonization, oral history, US imperialism, environmental justice, and the Oceti Sakowin. Thank you, AJ and Nick, for being here. AJ, you have the floor.
Hello, and thank you, Yanis, thank you, Varsha, thank you, Vijay, for this wonderful introduction. First of all, today is a joyful day for me, and I hope we first and foremost acknowledge and share this joy of coming together as the progressive peoples and the movements of the world. After all, we are all here because we believe that the world can be a more joyful place. I am also delighted to come together with all these people who do not wait for hope to appear magically. We all know that hope is a matter made of determination. We are also the people who believe that understanding and action are not two separate aspects of humankind, but they are inseparably intertwined. Also, I believe that good majority of us here unhesitantly would call the current global danger, which is fascism, in a different outfit. I am using and will be using words such as hope, dignity, happiness, and joy, because when people's trust in words are damaged, it is always very good to go back to basics. Also, the other reason is that when too many leftists come together, sometimes the discussions are too heated, and then it becomes easier to forget that why we came together in the first place. So I hope at the end of this summit, we will all remember that being a progressive in its very essence is to choose to trust in humankind. I personally was very much looking forward to this commitment to international solidarity. Since 2016, I have that the right-wing populism is a global wave, and it's going to corrupt all the democracies in the world in the exact same way. What is perceived as a political insanity in each country has in fact a logic and a pattern. This is why I wrote How to Lose a Country. This is bigger than Trump, Modi, Johnson, or Le Pen, and as opposed to many may think, it will leave a damage, a permanent damage, politically and morally, unless the peoples of the world come together in action for self-defense globally. This strange political fruit has been ripening since 1980s, and it is the natural consequence of unleashed neoliberal fantasies. Right-wing populism is a structural failure of neoliberalism and natural consequence of its damage on democracy. The lead figures of this political wave are only the last mercenaries of a falling castle, which we call neoliberalism. It took too long to recognize these figures as leaders gravitating towards fascism. Since this time, they didn't come in uniforms. And today, they are running the most powerful countries in the world. And we are here simply to say that the peoples, when together, can cure this crisis. We, as the progressives, have been through a lot since late 80s, but today are not anymore as the village fools, and imagining a world beyond capitalism is no more intellectual. Capitalism is in such a desperate cul-de-sac that these intellectual strongholds are looking for an end. A power vacuum is. This is a time we come up with answers and voice them strongly and united enough so that the words of the humane and sanity are not dismissed anymore. We owe this to the previous generations who sacrificed their lives while fighting the brutality of capitalism, and to the young people who found a crumbling planet on their lap. Yanis, after giving a thorough explanation for the way out, left us with two unanswered questions. What comes after capitalism and how we are going to organize within Progressive International? What comes after capitalism is already being answered in action, in words. The life after capitalism was already visible as a glimpse on Tahrir, in Gezi protests, and all Occupy movements, including Black Lives Matter. One of the commonalities of these protests is that resisting people did not want to leave the space even after the planned demonstrations were over. They occupied the space to create miniature lives. What they did not want to part with, in its very essence, was the joy of dignity and the kindness of the new life they created and shared together. These are pioneering political organisms of the life that will begin after capitalism. These are also signs presenting us with the fact that the question how to organize becomes only manageable when in physical action. It is a little bit ironic to say this in a virtual summit, but what will be leading us to organizing is physical action. Although Yannis is correct, the time has come to learn from these pioneering political organisms and take it to the next level. And we will be able to show the world physically, when these days are over, that the human is capable of organizing itself around kindness, love, justice, friendship, solidarity, and dignity. In real politics, we are going through a time where the banality created its own brand of evil, and shamelessness has become a political tool that is paralyzing all political mechanisms. Thanks to the right-wing populist leaders, ruthless is now a badge of honor for their supporters. Due to these severe political and moral conditions, several countries are living on the brink of true violence. Therefore, the words such as joy, love, or friendship might sound too fragile for our times, but we are also here to refresh the faith in humankind. And only reminding people that these words are our political and moral fulcrums can refresh that faith. Only then we can say, I believe in you and you can believe in me. We can do this together. And what we are doing here is today, in fact, telling each other, I believe in you. Together we can do this better. Thank you all for your participation. And I have to tell you, looking at this screen, I believe in you.
Thank you so much, AJ. And we're, of course, all bound by that love and solidarity that you spoke of. I want to now give the floor to Nick for his comments.
Hamitakapi nape chuzapi chante washte. I wanted to begin my my remarks with a traditional Lakota greeting, because in this greeting we say, we greet all of our relatives with an open heart and an open mind. And that's the kind of tone that I want to set with the Progressive International, and to think about our relations, not just as comrades, as people in struggle, but also as relatives who share a planet together. And hopefully we can imagine and begin to construct a future that is premised on justice. And in this current moment, it's difficult to imagine what that future will look like. And as our friends have said in this panel, that future must be, in my opinion, socialist. There's no other way. There's no other path forward. And so, to understand this current moment, we have to understand that there's a desperate search for reason behind tragedy in this particular moment. And I want to focus my comments on three specific points, just to build on what my friend Yannis had talked about in his opening remarks. The first is ending the sanctions. The second is this idea that has been popularized among indigenous movements around land back. And then the third one is wealth back. So the first one, economic sanctions, as my friend Vijay had said before, this is part of a hybrid war where, it's not just military aggression, but it's also the use of sanctions, right? So economic sanctions, frequently hailed by politicians of all stripes as a humane alternative to war, are simply war by another means. US and European nations sanctions currently hit hard in 39 countries, or 1/3 of humanity, causing currency inflation and devaluation and upsetting the distribution of medicine, food, power, water treatment, and other basic human needs. A 2019 report by the Center for Economic and Policy Studies found that US sanctions on Venezuela, for example, accounted for an estimated 40,000 deaths and a loss of $6 billion in oil revenue between 2017 and 2018. And as Iran began to experience increased rates of coronavirus infection just this year, the country faced medical supply shortages because of sanctions. And while countries like China and Cuba themselves, both sanctioned by the United States, provided international aid to other countries suffering from the pandemic, this country that I live in actively prevented other countries from adequately responding to the crisis through the use of economic sanctions. And to top things off, this May, Trump withdrew from the WHO in protest, shifting the blame to China for his own country's failure to stop the virus's spread. And so not only is the United States failing to address the coronavirus, but has also attempted to prevent the rest of the world from addressing the coronavirus. And this relates to indigenous people in the sense that the Venezuelan crisis in oil production in North America is directly related to the development of oil and gas in both Canada and the United States. So since 2008 to now, there has been an 80% increase in domestic oil production in the US. This has come largely at the expense of indigenous people and indigenous lands. Many of these oil pipelines, such as the Keystone XL pipeline, are drawing down oil from the dirtiest region, or the dirtiest oil in the world, which comes from the tar sands region in Alberta, Canada, which has created a dead zone with a surface area larger than the state of Florida. And this was partially due to the United States and Canada effectively waging an economic war against Venezuela to choke out its own oil production. So we can trace the construction of oil pipelines and the development of oil and gas within the United States and Canada as a continued war against Venezuela, choking out its own economy. And we have to ask, what would Venezuela look like without sanctions? What kind of society is the Bolivarian Revolutionary Project building? The second point I want to make is about land back and talking about the possibilities of indigenous caretaking and stewardship of the natural environment. So currently, 3/4 of land-based environments and 2/3 of marine environments have been affected by capitalist development. But environmental degradation has been less severe in places managed by indigenous peoples and local communities, a UN report recently found. And while only 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples also protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples and local communities who have distinct cultural and social ties to ancestral homelands and bioregions still caretake at least 1/4 of the world's land area. This includes places that are the lungs of the world, such as the Amazon rainforest, and where I'm from, the Missouri River Basin, areas facing existential threats of deforestation, damming, water contamination, oil and gas development, and mining. Indigenous peoples protect the land, air, and water we all need to live. This is why indigenous environmental activists are so severely criminalized and targeted for assassination in response to our organizing throughout the world. We are always in the way. And lastly, I want to turn to when we talk about the conversation that's been, spurred up by this idea of the Green New Deal, I think needs to be regrounded in the geopolitics of the world as it stands right now, and specifically thinking about this notion of imperialism and what a post-carbon future and a post-capitalist future would look like. And to do that, I want to turn specifically to Bolivia, because one of the most important expressions of an eco-socialist vision of a just future came in 2010 in Cochabamba, in what were known as the People's Accords. The Accords proposed not only just relations with the natural world, but also upending the unequal relations between entire nations and humans themselves, in systems we know as imperialism and capitalism. Under indigenous and social movement leadership, the movement towards socialism, the People's Accord infused traditional ecological knowledge with ecofeminism, eco-socialism, and anti-imperialism. The indigenous Andean cosmovision of vivir bien, or living well, and Pachamama, or Mother Earth, are central to understanding the People's Accords. Living well is not anthropocentric or just focused on human relations. It is earth-centric, focusing on the whole. It understands that capitalist domination over nature is patriarchal, and that overconsumption, which is driven by the first world, is not the solution, but the problem. If all humanity consumed as much as the average US citizen, we would need 4 Earths to sustain it. We only have one planet to share, and just relations with the natural world are impossible without just, equitable relations among humanity first. And so, as we think about the Green New Deal, I want to propose several things, several key points that come from the People's Accord of 2010 that we could use in this conversation. The first is to decolonize the atmosphere. restore to nations, developing countries, the atmospheric space that is occupied by the first world by greenhouse gas emissions. This means decolonization of the atmosphere through the reduction and absorption of their emissions. Transfer technology. The global north must assume all the costs and technology transferred needs of the global south nations who have lost development opportunities due to living under the boot of US imperialism or in restricted atmospheric space. The third point, open the borders. Because climate-induced migration has caused an increase in restrictive immigration policies from the first world, we have to address the needs of our migrant, the mass migration that are happening because of climate change. The fourth is pay climate debt. And this is a conversation that needs to be expanded within the Green New Deal. First world countries must be responsible for the lion's shares of adaptation debt related to the impacts of climate change on developing countries by providing the means to prevent, minimize, and deal with damages arising from their excessive emissions. And then, and lastly, we need to think about mass land return or land restoration. Return land to its original caretakers. Within this hemisphere, it means indigenous nations or indigenous peoples. Billions of acres of territory have been taken out of indigenous ecological stewardship, resulting in mass extinctions and mass displacement. Restoring land to indigenous caretakers is a necessary step towards ensuring any kind of future on this planet. And so lastly, I will just leave with the kind of the calls to action that the people on this planet have already addressed. The first, from an indigenous perspective, and for the future of humanity, is that we need decolonization or extinction. It's socialism or extinction, internationalism or extinction, and that to end the sanctions, land back, but also wealth back to the workers of the world. And for all of these things to happen, and for all of these things to occur, this means a future back for humanity. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thanks again to all of our panelists for these articulate and inspiring statements. I want to kick off these last 20 minutes of discussion by giving Yanis an opportunity to respond to the panelists' remarks, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. Yanis, I hope that you're in a place of safety now, and please feel free to keep your video off. We understand you're dealing with a hurricane. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I hope the audio at least is working in the midst of this disaster. If it does, then I will continue. Okay. Well, thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Nick. Thank you all, Vasha, Ece. Solidarity from a Greek to a Turk at this moment, I think, needs to be stated very loudly and very clearly, and vice versa, I'm sure. A quick comment that started ringing in my head as I was listening to all of you comrades. I'm a socialist. I think I was born a socialist. I certainly will die a socialist. But I need to say a few words which I'm plagiarizing from my great friend Slavoj Žižek, who I think when he visited the Occupy Wall Street Square in New York City back in the day, while he was addressing the crowd, he said to them, he warned them not to fall in love with themselves, to remain supremely critical of one another and particularly of oneself. Because, we socialists, we cannot pretend that in the year 2020, we can simply speak the word socialism and have, billions of people out there applaud enthusiastically, because we have, in the name of socialism, not we as individuals, but others in the name of socialism have done a great deal of damage to humanity. We cannot pretend, for instance, that we live, and I don't want to pretend that I live in a Cold War situation like, Soviet Union versus the United States, when you had to take sides. At the moment, of course, we're going to, send our arrows against the Cold Warriors who are trying to create a new Cold War between the United States and China, who are trying to portray China as an imperialist power, who, the United States and Britain, for instance, or the European Union for that matter. But at the same time, as progressives and as genuine socialists, we have to acknowledge that things are happening within China that are the stuff of class struggle. There is a huge class struggle happening within China. There is a lot of repression happening within China. We are going to defend China from the imperialism of the United States, while at the same time subjecting the Chinese Communist Party to severe criticism for backing a vast class struggle against the majority of the Chinese, against minorities who are being treated in a way that progressives cannot back. It's very important that we find our own footing as a progressive international of how to push forward with a clear socialist agenda, a post-capitalist agenda, while at the same time not falling prey to the old Cold War trials and tribulations of the left that felt the need to, support the insupportable aspects of the Soviet Gulag archipelago. I know for sure that if I lived in the Soviet Union, I would be in the Gulag. My father taught me, as somebody who spent 4 years as a communist in a concentration camp for communists, that had his folks, his comrades, won the civil war. Instead of being on the losing side, he would end up probably in the same concentration camp with different guards. So, because this is the very beginning of the Progressive International, I think that what is going to give us enormous energy and an enormous capacity to mobilize and to energize progressives is what the anarcho-syndicalists were very good at in the 1930s. Yeah, you remember the black and red flag in the Spanish Civil War of the anarcho-syndicalists. Red for the revolution, for the power of love and humanity and optimism and hope, but also black to remind ourselves of the dark side in each one of us.
Thanks, Yanis. And opening up to the panel, if anyone wants to respond.
Sure. I would like to respond. It's lovely to have these conversations. And I think it's important because I believe very much at a time when war is not only there in the South China Sea, but in the Eastern Mediterranean, where war is a real possibility, a united front is very important. On the other hand, Yanis well knows that there's another part of the Cold War I don't want to return to, and that's the intensity of intra-left-wing fratricide, where the left just tore each other apart. I'm not prepared for that either. Remember that from 1917 onward, the left has had a tendency to split, to disagree on things, and so on. Yanis and I will not agree on what's happening in China. We will not agree in our assessment on the Chinese Communist Party. We will not agree in the nature of how to assess the situation in China, and that's fine. We don't have to agree on everything. We will agree that the US imposed war on China is out of the question. I think that's important. We will agree that in all societies, class struggles persist, that even in a socialist context, it's not perfection. There will continue to be contradictions. I'm here to build unities. I'm here to find a place to advance the agenda of humanity. I don't want to repeat the lessons of the Cold War, but from a completely different perspective. It's not the lessons of the Cold War being, let's be silent about things happening, in the camp of the left or whatever. I'm not interested only in that lesson. I'm interested in the other lesson. Let's not constantly tear each other apart. Let's find a way to build unities. Let's build unity in action. Let's see where we can act together, because the stakes are much too high to focus on our differences.
Thank you, Vijay. AJ, Nick, any response?
Solidarity from a Turk to a Greek in these hard times. Yanis did not hear me when I said exactly, yes, I do that too. So now he may hear me. I totally agree with Vijay. I use words, very basic words such as love, hope, dignity, kindness, and so on, not because I am naive. I don't have the luxury. I never had the luxury of being naive. It is just that I have Turkey, and I'm from a country where the leftists tore each other like in the most merciless way possible. And we saw at the end that it doesn't work at all. And it was really fast, you see. It was only 80s that the leftist, being a leftist was a sinful thing. And it was only 2010, I was in a university, I don't know, probably Harvard in United States giving a speech. And when I mentioned the word socialism, there was this strange silence and tension in the room. And all of a sudden, socialism is now a word that we can normally speak, thanks to Bernie Sanders and thousands of people who made it happen in the United States. So it is very new that we are talking about these things. So I think we can also use this, this little, small period of time, falling a little bit in love with ourselves, because nobody loves us. We have to love ourselves. It is important to fall in love with ourselves, I think, and there is nothing wrong with that, because we know what a realistic love towards human is. We don't love human like a religious evangelist person. We don't love human like a naive humanist. We love human despite the black matter in him.
I think everyone has said what already needs to be said. I will just say one thing, in that in this particular moment in time, in places like the United States, even the advocacy for a tepid social democracy, such as Medicare for all, has been met with renunciation by all kind of forces, even forces on the so-called left here. And what we get instead are prisons and more death. We can't even begin to talk about the conversation around healthcare in this country without facing armed fascists in the street. We can't even begin to talk about the conversation of police reform in this country without armed fascists in the streets, and a kind of rise of a neo-fascism. And in that sense, there's a lot of danger in this moment in time. And instead, I think it is important to have these conversations around debating positions specifically as it relates to imperialism. But nonetheless, we have to acknowledge our position within, I live in the United States and within the global North, that we have a special obligation. We can criticize all of these socialist projects as much as we want to, but those conversations might as well be happening on the moon if we're not doing anything to prevent our countries from implementing sanctions or implementing imperialist aggression towards them in the South China Sea. We can have all of these conversations in the world, but they might as well be happening on the moon, because they don't impact the actual policy that's being implemented by these aggressors and by these imperialist countries. And so I think that should always be our primary focus, is a pivot to peace, instead of the pivot to Asia, is a pivot towards just relations amongst the nations of the world. And to do that, people in the global North, movements in the global North, have a special obligation that they have to take seriously.
Thank you, Nick. I should convey a message from Yanis, who unfortunately doesn't have access to his microphone right now, that he is in complete agreement with Vijay. So that seems like a good note for me to ask all of you here on the theme of post-capitalism, for which we convened this panel today. Any final words on sort of how you approach the theme and what your vision is for post-capitalism? Vijay.
Somebody, I was just gesturing to my Look, I'm a Marxist. I believe only in socialism. I don't have any faith in the capitalist system. Let that be said. But I'm actually very worried about the situation now. Half the world's population is struggling with hunger. I don't think any socialist, anybody from our tradition, must turn their eyes away from this immediate calamity. Because of the catastrophic way that the countries like the United States, Brazil, India, most European countries, catastrophic way in which they've dealt with the pandemic. Patriarchal violence has increased, hunger has increased, employment has collapsed in most of these societies. I mean, we really need to dig deep into the question of hunger. In India, for instance, people in the communist movement are out on the street. In Brazil, the landless workers movement out on the street feeding people. That's what is necessary at this time. We have to tackle patriarchal violence in this moment. We have to tackle hunger. The road to post-capitalism, the road to socialism is not built without an engagement with the present. And in the present, this is our catastrophe. And unless we are there feeding people, fighting against patriarchal violence, there is no road into the future.
Thank you, Vijay.
I
see
AJ. So it has been very short that we started to think. I don't mean we as in people here. The scholars have been thinking, socialists have been thinking, and so on. But the mainstream people, the normal people, ordinary people, it is very new to them, to imagine what's after capitalism. Actually, they came to this idea first with the climate action, and then now during Corona. They are, new into this business. So I think if we want to enlarge this progressive international, to an extent that ordinary people will join as well, we have to think about that. They haven't been following all these things that we have been following in terms of politics and in terms of history, near history. So that is why I do believe that making them believe in themselves so that they can imagine a world, a life beyond capitalism is pretty important. The Londoners, ordinary people who are not socialists, who are not politically engaged, they are seeing in their own lives that they can actually come together and resist to the landlords. This is so new. Please, let's remember that there was there was 1980s and 1990s where all the memory of the left globally was erased from the face of the earth. So we are actually reminding people that our ancestors, the people, the generations that came before us did this. They tried it. But the time was not right. And now the time is right because there is no other option than socialism, democratic socialism.
I just want to emphasize, what others have said, but I also think we need to turn to the social movements, those who are experimenting in the streets, those who are creating the future, those who are looking beyond just the limits of electoralism and actually sowing the seeds and building the institutions. These things they do arise organically and spontaneously, but we actually need institutions to sustain them from struggle to struggle. And that requires learning, I think, and looking to the examples of those who have dared to try and those who have dared to struggle and the consequences that they've paid for envisioning a future, especially if we look at Bolivia and the US-backed coup and the way in which a lot of our friends fell easily into the narratives that were promoted by the State Department specifically to demonize somebody like Evo Morales or to demonize indigenous people who had for the first time in the history of their country, for 13 years, 13 short years, had grasped their own destiny and began to develop and not just for indigenous people. It wasn't a particular struggle, it was a universal struggle, right? And that's something that I want to impart. It's indigenous issues they're not just like, oh, it's an indigenous identity issue, you guys do your little spirituality thing over here, that's fine. We look as people in the North, we're jealous, and we look to the leadership of especially our Bolivian comrades. Like when Evo Morales became president, I said, that man looks like my uncle. and we need that kind of leadership and development, because we understand that when the humble people of the earth shrug, the entire world moves. And we saw that, and that's what made the movement towards socialism. That's what made the project in Venezuela and Cuba such a threat, because that Cold War that we were debating about earlier was actually a decolonization movement, and it continues on into the 21st century. And we have to look to these struggles, and especially in the global South, that are daring to struggle but also winning, and we can't be afraid of victories as well. And so I think this moment in time is, as much as there's great and terrible danger that's confronting us, there is a great opportunity for possibility, and that means, yes, for me, it's socialism is the future, but also this great challenge of taking these ideas to the street, but also using the knowledge that has been produced by other movements that have been successful, and thinking about the leadership and the areas of struggle that we need to focus on in other parts of the world. And so with that, I think this is a great opportunity with the Progressive International to bring together a diverse group of people, scholars and intellectuals, but we owe it to our main theoreticians, who are those who are in the streets, those who are producing these new knowledges. We're just refining them, and hopefully we can produce the confidence to continue that struggle to build that future.
I see the panel agrees, Nick. Thank you so much for those words. I think a note of courage in learning from each other is exactly sort of the ethos of the Progressive International movement. This was an absolutely incredible discussion and a terrific start to the inaugural summit of the Progressive International. I want to thank our speakers once again for being here today, and also for guiding the work of internationalism as members of the Progressive International's Council. Thanks so much also to our audience. I see that we're connected to people from around the world today with this broadcast. We invite you to join us, to donate to us, support us. Let's continue to mobilize progressive forces around the world in a common front. Next up, we have a keynote by Naomi Klein, followed by a panel discussion with Tasneem Essop, Vanessa Nakate, and Aruna Roy on the years of repair. They discuss how we can use this time for reparation on multiple fronts: climate, race, economy, and the infrastructure. It's going to be wonderful, so do stay tuned, and we'll be back in 30 minutes. Thank you.